person that we have coming on is Lauren Sirota, and she's very, very special. Okay, I just wanted to make sure everyone's mic'd up. So Lauren is the design director and a co-founder at CRADL. And what makes Lauren so great is she's an incredible product strategist. But for this panel specifically, Lauren spent a pretty significant amount of time building the financial system in Myanmar and researching how it could serve rice farmers. And one thing she told me that I just thought was super fascinating is that most of the banking system operates on the Gregorian calendar, but farmers operate on monsoon season. They operate relating to the lunar calendar. So if you're talking about building a financial system that works for people, you have to understand how they experience the world before you end up building that. So I'm so excited to welcome Lauren Sirota to the stage.
Thanks, Catherine. You never really know what's going to stick when you tell people things. So I'm glad it was one of those things that was really, really important. And we were so lucky to have that panel on generational wealth just before us. One of the things that they were saying, which I think is a perfect segue into what we're going to talk about today, is that there need to be fundamental shifts in how we think about financial services and how they're implemented. So I'm so excited to be hosting a panel today with 3 people who are doing that and who are really thinking about the final mile, but also what financial services can and should be in order to actually create financial health globally, not just in communities that have been banked and benefiting from existing financial infrastructure. So I'm going to introduce folks, I guess, one by one as you come out. So I'd like to first introduce Marco Barbosa. Yes, everybody clap for Marco. Welcome, Marco. He's building impactMarket, which is a human empowerment protocol that unlocks access to finance and unconditional basic income, different from universal basic income, which we'll talk about. And he has spent a lot of time in the fundraising space and realized that it was very difficult for people who wanted to give to actually know who they were giving to and give it to the right people who could most benefit from that aid. And so knows this space very well and has been really thoughtful in building impactMarket. So welcome to the stage.
Thank you.
Oluwaseun-David is the head of research for the Africa Blockchain Institute, so coming all the way from Kigali. So thank you so much for making it here, Oluwaseun. He's an extremely important advocate for the innovation ecosystem across the African continent and publishes is the editor of the Africa Blockchain Report. So I think we actually have a few copies of the Africa Blockchain Report, and we'll talk at a very high level about some of the things he's seeing in places like Uganda and Nigeria and how crypto is making a big difference there. And then finally to the stage, I'd like to welcome Fennie Wang. Fennie Wang, you may know, is the CEO and founder of Humanity Cash. She, and if anybody's familiar with the Berkshires project, anyone? Show of hands. All right, okay, so some Fennie fans in here. Berkshires is a community currency that she's developed and has piloted. And one of the things that I love about what you're doing is that you're also now partnering with MIT to implement a basic income project and also measure the impact, the economic impact of this type of a project long term using a bunch of different indicators. So not just implementing a project, but also saying, let's bring on people to measure how effective it is. So thank you so much for doing that and welcome. I suppose I can sit now. This is what I get for not watching the other panels and how they compose themselves. So Fennie, I would love to start with you. So Berkshires is built around this concept that keeping a currency and kind of value within the community will create better economic outcomes and better financial health for the community. Why is that?
So to explain a little bit about the rationale behind community currencies, they've existed for quite a long time, for over 100 years, and the idea is to keep wealth recirculating locally, especially in the context where when money is so liquid and in a globalized economy, it's so easy for money to leave a community. So we can live in a certain community and have not really deep economic ties to it. We can have a remote job, we could buy everything from Amazon. So the idea of that local currency is to say, well, can we more intentionally direct the money so that we create this multiplier impact? And that's really the key to it. A dollar in a local dollar that goes to support small businesses, for example, can have 3 to 4 times the economic impact. So for $1, you get $3 or $4 worth of economic impact in that local community. With the particular model that we're working on, it is backed by one-on-one backed by federal dollars, held with community banks, and that's really key because the role of a community bank is to take the reserves, your reserves, which are deposits, as loan capital that they're going to use to fund productive activities in that local economy. So community banks in the U.S. are outsized in terms of their contributions for making small business loans, loans to local farms, and also local commercial real estate development. So if you look at the numbers, with the Berkshires, we've worked with 2 community banks, and for both of these community banks, for every $1 of deposit that you hold with them, 70 cents are going to be reinvested in that local economy. When you look at Chase Bank, for example, that's the biggest bank in the U.S., for every $1 deposits, only 20 cents is reinvested in the local economy. So there's a huge multiplier impact there in supporting our community banks. And the wonderful thing about a community currencies, what we're doing as a community is mutualizing our deposits together and then making exchange amongst each other. And that allows us to not have to withdraw money, our deposits from our community bank, which means our community bank can reinvest that money longer into real projects in our community. So that's the beauty of having that kind of circular economy.
What I think is so interesting about the work that you're doing is you're actually using an existing piece of infrastructure, so community banks and credit unions, as an intermediary. And that is kind of the piece of the legacy system that you see is working because they understand the needs of the community, they're embedded, and ultimately they're reinvesting at a hyperlocal level. And so that's really, I know that we've talked a lot about the theme of the Web3athon as being hyperlocal, but I think all 3 of you think that that's probably the most important thing in creating long-term financial resilience, financial health, right, is understanding the needs at a local level and financial institutions finding ways to support localized needs. So I think that that's a really cool vector and shows this, I think, a very elegant interplay between a decentralized world and an existing incumbent centralized one, which is really rare. As we were talking about, backstage, there's a lot of tension between the new and the old, and even now between the privatized and the public. And so to see this this fantastic opportunity of working together and playing off of each other's strengths, I think that that's really, really powerful. And Marco, I think you share kind of a similar belief in that, having access to finance and keeping it at the community level can kind of provide opportunities to elevate an entire community out of poverty. Can you talk a little bit about specifically how access to finance through something like impactMarket can unlock potentials for communities?
Sure. So I'm not so much on the depth of using existing infrastructure or private sector or whatever, because that has been, there are almost 2 billion people unbanked in the world, and one of the biggest traps or blockers for people that are still living in extreme poverty in very rural areas is because they don't have access to finance. Like, banks and governments just don't care kind of about them, so they don't have access to an infrastructure, they cannot have access to credit or wealth or able to uplift themselves or in an easier way like we do like in a developed country. So somehow like the work we are doing is providing a conditional basic income which you mentioned that is different from universal basic income. And the difference is that universal says that any human being in the world should get access to a level of wealth that puts themselves in a position of above a poverty line or extreme poverty line. Unconditional is a specific part of it that says that whatever money that you receive, you can use it in whatever you want, and it's up to you. It's unconditional. There is no conditions around that. So we work in a lot of, we provide our infrastructure is a DAO that then donors can send money to the DAO. It has a treasury, and then local charities or even community leaders or people that live in refugee camps, resident favelas, local farmers, even indigenous communities that we have, they can apply to receive a basic income, and then define like if it's 20 cents, 30 cents, depending like how much the dollar amount has impact on the local currency. And basically like most of these people they are unbanked, and even some of them don't have even an ID, so or they are running away from other country because it's in a very difficult situation. And in our case, basically, we provide focused on fighting extreme poverty, but at the same time the same what she was saying about there is a multiplier effect, because you see like the money going in different communities, and then you see the volume and transactions, and it kind of growing with how many addresses they are transacting with, and you see like the volume of transacting only between the beneficiaries usually is 3 to 4 times more than the money they are getting. And even like local merchants and all the other kind of local businesses benefit from that. And this is only possible because of this new technology. And these communities are very grateful, and one of the reasons is that as well, like we are able to go to countries like Togo, Mali, Congo, Myanmar, Yemen, Afghanistan, Venezuela, and others, almost 40 now. And because and the government, some governments are making questions about us, but we say like, okay, good luck with that. This technology can bypass everything. So all the blockers and how, some countries have the dictatorships, or, financial system is very fragmented and very, tendentious for some sides. So this way the people have ownership of their money, they have access to a currency that is stronger than the local one, that is dollars, and they are free, and the money is them. No one can take their money away from them, and they can transact it for whatever they believe is important to them. So, because that's another problem, is that sometimes we give money in the developed world to someone, and we think that we know best how they should spend that money. In this case, it's completely different.
Well, it's very hard to track that, right, though? So I think that that's a very naive assumption that, it's an arrogant assumption that anybody knows how someone else should be spending money, and then secondly, naive that we can track how they're spending money. I'm sure that most people in this room know that somebody needs money, they need money for the thing they need money for, and they will borrow it from someone else to make it work. And so you're just creating a problematic cycle, actually, if you're loaning just for a specific thing and trying to monitor that. So it makes sense to be giving people money and then letting them decide what they need it for. There are a couple of mechanisms that I think are really interesting about what you're doing, and one of them, if you could describe kind of really quickly the way that money is administered and like kind of the timing. So it's a combination of kind of the localized administration through the community, which I think is really, you don't have like a country office deciding who gets paid, and it's really done by the community. And then also this mechanism to determine when money gets paid out and how frequently it gets paid out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there is kind of two main mechanisms. One is on the donor side. So when someone makes a donation, they receive kind of governance tokens. So they become a kind of a shareholder or stakeholders on the protocol itself. So if you compare to the traditional philanthropy, you make a donation after the money goes out of your bank account, you have no idea what happens. In this case, you actually can track and see and you can choose which community you want to support, and also you give governance. And the more it grows, the protocol, you have also like a piece of it, and also that grows as well. So it's a kind of a donation/investment that also gives you also governance that is not possible currently in philanthropy. And in the other side is like, for example, a local charity or community leader can go to our app or website and just fulfill and say, okay, this is how many people we want to reach. This is how much each individual or beneficiary can claim, the amount per claim, what's the minimum time they have to wait between each claim. So let's say 24 hours, let's say like $1, 24 hours. Then what's the maximum amount each individual can claim in total, let's say $300. And then there is a kind of a time dilation or a time increment. That, for example, if it's 5 minutes, what it means is that someone claims, they have to wait at least 24 hours, then claim again at least 24 hours and 5 minutes, then claim again 24 hours and 10 minutes, to claim again 24 hours and 15 minutes. So there's a time dilation. What it means is that after like 1 year, they are claiming like the same amount after each 2 days. So there is, and also it's on demand, so it's not streaming. And then we measure like the average of the time difference between when they can claim and when they actually claim. And the difference in this time over time also help us understand the urgency and the self-sustainability growth of this community.
That's super interesting, and I think it will be interesting to see as time goes on how much flexibility people need in that administration. But it's certainly something that will be cool to watch. Oluwaseun, you've spent a lot of time in discussion with me, and I'm sure in discussion with a lot of people, explaining how the banking system. The banking system, by the way, globally, hasn't really served us. It's a utility, but still people within the banking infrastructure, I think it's only 26% report to be financially healthy. So So banks are definitely not the answer, but they certainly aren't the answer in a lot of places where even though people may have a relationship with the bank, they themselves don't benefit from the bank. So can you talk a little bit about the possibility for kind of decentralized currencies in alleviating some of these problems?
Yeah, thank you very much. When we talk about the potentials of the blockchain technology itself with the cryptocurrency use case, we usually don't pay attention to the data that speaks to the vulnerables and the people that are living in rural areas. And like I said yesterday on the panel I participated in, we read this data all the time that we have 400 million unbanked people in Africa, for example. And we keep creating solutions that does not speak to solving that problem, with our fintechs and all these financial solutions we are providing. So I think the promise of crypto is freedom, and we must connect that freedom to the people that need it most. So I'll speak first of all for, I've worked a little bit with refugees, and I have a number of refugees as friends. And these are guys who have families. Most of them have kids back home. And because of the inconsistent, immigration issues they've had, because of a lot of issues with their identity, they are usually not given opportunity in the traditional banking system, which is not supposed to be. Most countries will not tell you that they have stigma for these people, but the truth is they still go through the stigma, right? And I was speaking to a friend who has been a refugee for almost 9 years in the location where I currently work from, and whenever he wants to send money home, he would give the money to a friend that is in that country. Then the friend will go to the bank for him and send the money to his wife in his country, and the money usually takes like 7 days to arrive.
Extremely efficient.
Yes. Then he discovered crypto, right? And he could manage his own crypto wallet, send it, then taught his wife how to receive the money on the other hand. And in less than 24 hours, they could do peer-to-peer at the location, and the lady is able to pay for the school fee of the children and take care of the house, right? So another situation is around refugee entrepreneurship. Right? A lot of startups, I've read about 3 startups who are developing a system where you do not need a lot of KYC and identification before you're able to borrow money as a refugee to do business. And when you look at places like South Sudan, Rwanda, Kenya, Tanzania, they have this big community of refugees who are structured in such a way that they're able to do business by themselves. And there's also a company in Rwanda called Inkomoko. They were acquired by a company called Africa Entrepreneurship Collective recently, and they give small loans via digital asset and platforms to refugees to do businesses, and they have 90% loan return rate. That tells you that something is there as a business model for blockchain and crypto solutions.
And these are to people that would otherwise not be able to have access to a formal financial instrument.
Yes, yeah. Yes. And also, when people also come together, a lot of farmers cooperatives work in Africa, and they're able to also, go to, the strength of farmers cooperative is becoming so much that they can actually determine what they want and make statements to the traditional banks on demands of what they want. But on the business side, I think there's a lot of opportunity for crypto, for farmers cooperatives, refugee entrepreneurships, and also remittances, international remittances for refugees, basically. And other use cases would be around tokenization of value, because when you look at the problems that we face in the society, they are so enormous that we can look at the problems we can bundle into one solution, and also look at the ones we can address one by one, right? So there's something in the grassroots that we are not paying attention to, and we attend international conferences, speak on big platforms, and we talk about these big statistics that we are not paying attention to and not doing anything about. And it seems we are majoring on the minor and minoring on the major when it comes to financial inclusion. And I think crypto promises a big impact for for the downtrodden, for the people we usually don't talk about, and for the vulnerables. The last example I would give, I visited Namibia recently, and I stayed in the Airbnb of a particular guy who is into property investment, and he told us that when there was a time there was this financial crisis in Namibia, and he had properties for elites and also had properties in the slums. He told us that for 6 months, those bank managers and professionals who are living in his house in the city could not pay the rent. But those guys in the slums never missed paying their rent because they figured out how to maintain their financial fortunes as small as it is. And the multiplication of that can give us insights into the kind of business models we can take there as digital asset managers or crypto solutions. So there's a lot of opportunity there, I believe.
Yeah, and we've talked a lot about creditworthiness specifically, and credit scoring being in a lot of places the key mechanism to allow people to access credit unconditionally, so without the approval of their co-op for things that they need to grow their business. And so I would imagine that there's a big tie into this when you realize that there is creditworthiness because you finally are giving people money and being able to prove that out.
Yeah.
So that's a really excellent example. I actually have a question, Fennie, for that because you were talking about credit and lending within local communities administered by these community banks and federal credit unions or local credit unions. Do you see similar things happening? Like, do you see things where there's a transition of the community financing model into like credit scoring, or how do you see those things interplaying with each other?
The strength of community banks is relationship banking. So when you look at what happened during the pandemic, in the US, there was a federal program called the Paycheck Protection Program, and community banks were instrumental in administering PPP loans quickly because they had those relationships and they understood that the businesses were coming to them were not fraudulent. So when you look at the number of the volume of PPP loans issued, 85% of that was issued by small banks, community banks with less than $1 billion in assets. So they were highly critical in ensuring that kind of critical liquidity went to those local businesses because those relationships were in place. The other thing that I think is interesting as we think about digital money, as I said before, we're mutualizing our deposits together as a community, and therefore, couldn't the stable coin, right, that local stable coin itself be structured as some kind of Web3, whatever you want to call it, but a cooperative bank, right? Those models have existed for hundreds of years. So, for example, Lee Bank, which is one of the reserve banks for Berkshires, is a mutual bank. It does not have any shareholders, so it is owned by its depositors. It has been around since 1850. So it has survived a lot in U.S. history, from the Civil War to, countless wars and all this massive social, political, technological change, and it still thrives because it has that kind of responsibility and ownership by its very members and depositors. And can we compound those kind of models, right? Because mutual banks have been disappearing in America. They've been demutualizing with shareholders. And so we have an opportunity, again, to rethink those models. If the future of money is going to be tokenized deposits or stable coins or these types of flavors, the depositors should be owners of that mechanism and say, hey bank, we would like you, since this is our money, we would like you to ensure that there's more financial inclusion. Why aren't you lending more to minority-owned businesses? Why aren't you lending more to fund community-based, for example, solar projects and other critical infrastructure that we need to be more self-sufficient and economically self-reliant, support local supply chains, food security, and so forth. So that's really the goal towards how we can use also the power of our deposits towards governance.
I'm so happy that you brought up PPP, because why not? And that was an example of something that was corrected. There was, the administration of the first round, if anyone, who here got a PPP loan? Okay, so you had a tough couple of years. Thanks for keeping people employed and working your butts off. So people who got PPP loans, which were a lot of people in specific industries, the first time it was tough because most of it went to big banks, and a lot of small local businesses are banking with community banks and credit unions. And so they corrected that the second time, right? Because they realized the money was not going to the people who needed it most, and so they redistributed the second round of PPP to make sure it was going to the right financial intermediaries. But that's a very kind of common pattern of making decisions on high, distributing it through kind of large entities and not recognizing what is actually required and how much you need to know about the communities that you're trying to reach and who you should be working with and distributing through in order to reach them most effectively. And so I think one of the things that's very exciting about what each of you was talking about is like that there is work being done in this space. There's huge potential for this technology to be leveraged in a new way to kind of create a lot more agency for people on the ground, for communities to manage their own financial health and well-being, which is just fantastic news. I think for all of us who've worked in finance for quite some time, and it's felt relatively hopeless. And we've seen waves of fintech and a lot of promise of inclusion and all of these things. And things tend to get re-centralized, and it's the same people making decisions. So this is a refreshing kind of change of course. We're out of time. I'm going to do a quick lightning round. Okay, thanks. Brandon's giving me a head nod. That's okay. What's one word to summarize this particular moment for financial health and well-being?
I feel is an incredible white space, and if we can cultivate that would be, instead of getting bogged down towards politics, but there's an openness, an invitation to work together. So that's what I feel.
Thanks, Fennie.
For me, I would say we need to make true the slogan: competition is cooperation is the new competition for all the active players and stakeholders in the financial ecosystem. None of us should feel like we are the only savior of the ecosystem and the solutions we're trying to provide. I think when we're able to come together, we would accelerate our financial health.
Excellent, thank you.
One word, I will say disruption, but is too wide. I will say borderless. And I think that's specifically in a technology perspective, I think it's the first time that actually a technology is borderless, borderless in all the sense, in a society, in country, in all the ways that we put barriers for different kinds of access to different kind of resources. This technology actually doesn't care about where you live or the coordinates that you're born in, and you have access to it and you have ownership of it. So I think that I love technology, and I think that I'm very happy that this technology exists because finally we can bypass all those kind of barriers and problems and borders. So I would say borderless.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Marco. And thanks, y'all, for being here and for sharing with us. Thanks, y'all, for sticking around.